So in today's web dev tip, we're going to have a quick story review and then see where we're going to go next with the next story in our project. So the last thing we were working on was this giving the user the ability to choose a different URL to go to. And over the last few videos, hopefully we've seen how you can do that. We've created options in the front end, sanitized them in the back end, and then stored them in the database to be retrieved later on. So we've completed that, I would say, and it's been committed into the actual code base as well. But in order for it to be live and to be pushed up, there's one small change which we've kind of overlooked over the last few videos. It's only a small thing, it's not massively important, but I thought we'd fix that now just before we completely finish off this story. So if we just go over to the code for our project, and the change I want to make is actually in the API. So if we just go to the project, the Rick and Roll project, which is the API code, and if we have a look in the routes folder and the short URL routes, we've just got the one route in there which basically creates a new short URL in the database and assigns it some values. Most recently we've just added the target property into the record in the database, but you might have noticed here that we're hard coding the URL as a localhost URL. So this is massively important because when we handle the redirected URL, we just literally find the ID of this record in the database, and then we just basically find the target from there. So this URL property is quite superficial. It's just so we can see what it is that has been generated and identify the actual record if we need to in the database. But what might be good is instead of having the actual localhost address hard-coded in, we've got the actual domain URL in there so that it makes a little bit more sense. So let's go into our environments file, and we can actually copy this because we're going to use localhost 3333 for our development URLs because that's where they'll actually be set up. So if we go in here and say the API URL is this, then in the short URLs file for the routing, instead of having this in here just with the hard-coded URL, we'll reference the environment file and then the API URL. And then now this is handled by that environments file, which means, as you might have seen in other tutorials, we can actually go into the environment.prod.ts file, which is the environment file which is used for our production service. And then we can just do the same thing again. We can say the API URL is going to be the domain name for us. So we'll say rickandroll.me. So what we should find when we actually build our project for production now, the local host address that gets inserted into the database is actually replaced with this rickandroll.me domain. So let's just commit that and then push that up to our remote service. So we'll say beat is use environment files for API URLs. Okay, and we'll just push that while we're here as well. And that will go through and build it in our pipeline. And then we can move this story over here that's been completed just a moment ago to live because that'll be live on the domain service. And we've got the user's got the ability to have that choice. And also we've just tidied up that URL insertion into the database. So the next thing we're going to look at in our project is this story over here, which is to generate some stats for a short URL so that the owner, the person who's created the short URL, can see how many times it's been accessed. And it's just a way of verifying that the user that you've sent it to has actually accessed and used the short URL and indeed has been then rickrolled to the video that's been chosen. So in order to do that, we're going to set up a new web app, and that means a few things. We need to actually create the project in our mono repo, update our pipeline and create some configuration on the server. But we've done all of these tasks a few times before, so in the next video we'll just quickly run through getting this app set up, built into the pipeline and delivered into the live service. So the next video will be a bit of a skim through that process, a bit of a refresher if you can't remember exactly all of the different steps, and then we'll start working in the following tutorials on actually getting those stats to display and rendering out some of that content to show the information to the owner of the short URL. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.